I want to read you this thread. Really fascinating insight from a personal point of view in terms of what has been happening right from the beginning of the conflict with regard to Ukrainians with Russian families, and the fact that the Russian families just don't believe their own family members and are much more likely to believe the Russian media propaganda. And it's really been terribly sad. This annoyed me at the beginning of the conflict because it's just like, how can you believe Putin over your own brother or sister? And yet this was happening. I don't know if you guys saw a lot of accounts of these, but this was a really common occurrence right at the beginning of the conflict and right through. Well, this is Anastasia Klimash saying this, and I'll try and read it really quickly. In the first days of the full-scale invasion, I was probably contacted by more people than I knew. And up until today, I'm stunned by the kindness, understanding, and support I get from almost everyone around. Everyone, except my Russian relatives. They never reached out. I left Dnipro after spending 3 weeks with my parents, and for the past 2 nights, the Russian army has been shelling the city. I know it's unreasonable, but I can't help but feel guilty for not being there. Meanwhile, our Russian relatives haven't bothered to contact my family ever since February the 24th. These people visited us before in Ukraine and had our warm welcome. They know perfectly there are no Nazis here, but they don't care about their country waging this unjust war against us. Right now, our family in Ukraine is rather a liability for them. Uncomfortable facts. I repeat, they know everything. My Russian relatives have been watching my Instagram stories about the war since February 24th and remain silent. Some quietly unfollowed me later, including my Russian cousin who lives in Germany. It's not like FSB, so the Russian Secret Services, is breathing over her shoulder there. About 2 years ago, we met with my Russian cousin and her German husband in Copenhagen, visited DAC, ate some quality food, went to a dodgy club, giggled at some weird people there and had a chat. You know, the usual stuff bored millennials with degrees from European universities do. She's an architect, not a brainwashed dropout Vanya from a deprived Russian village with no internet. But even that is nonsense. They all have access to the information. Don't infantilize them. Her husband remains silent too. Speak of the influence of the Russian world, am I right? Her brother in Moscow, who several years ago told my mum, you need to understand, we don't make any decisions here. Also, for a week or so, watched my Instagram stories with photos of buildings obliterated by Russian missiles and unfollowed me too. My mum was babysitting this guy. My story is not exceptional. Many of my friends facing the same. Their Russian relatives are either silent or teach Ukrainians about what's actually happening in Ukraine. Of course, it's all the fault of the decadent West, or saying, yes, but we'll never know all the truth. Many were surprised by such Russian behavior. Not my family. Back in 2014, while the Russian missiles were flying over my parents' heads in Donbass, my Russian cousin called my mum and screamed at her, telling her she shouldn't say anything bad about Russia. Back then, she studied in France. And her mum, my aunt, phoned as well, telling my mum that our Russian girls are now getting bullied here in France. They are called invaders because of you. Say what? Later, we somehow got back to talking to these people every now and then, almost as if nothing happened, except for when they wanted to visit us. Then we were telling them that Crimea is Ukraine, and if they didn't agree, they were not welcome in Ukraine, and they didn't agree. I'm still not sure why we kept in touch. We, Ukrainians, always were way too patient with Russians. Did our patience and keeping in touch with our Russian relatives despite all their shit help? As you see, nope. It just made things worse. Sometimes a silly thought pops into my head. How will we ever forgive them? But then I remember that nobody is asking us for forgiveness. When foreigners are calling for a dialogue with Russia, I just laugh. We tried it all. If anything, our biggest mistake was being pushovers way too long. Not anymore. Being nice just doesn't work with Russians. Russia has to be defeated. And for this, we need the army of Ukraine. We need to arm Ukraine now, sorry. So that's a really powerful, testimony as to what is happening on the ground with peace. So many Ukrainians have family in Russia, and so many of these families are torn apart, as it seems almost entirely that those Russian family members are siding with their sense of nationalism and with Putin and believing all the propaganda that they are fed and not believing their own kith and kin. They're not believing their own sort of family members. It just seems absolutely outrageous.